being sort of a goal that can be kind of monetized, like in a cap and trade program, where there's revenues available to the state that could be, both there's potentially some price impacts that would encourage energy efficiency, but also revenues that can be used to fund state programs, and the lack of that is going to be.
That's U.S. How about Europe? You live in Zurich now. What about a European perspective? What's happening?
I can say, and the little I can say, I didn't see kind of a strong response of the market. Trying to come to respond or to try to make up for what is not being done in terms of energy policy in the U.S. I think from a voter point of view, it may have an impact, and it's always hard to say, but just to give you an interesting case study, in Switzerland, following the earthquake in Japan, the meltdown of the nuclear power plant, they decided, so in Switzerland they have a direct democracy, so they decided to vote on, and most of the energy from Switzerland is either on nuclear. So following the Fukushima meltdown, the Swiss people decided to vote whether or not they would like to phase out the nuclear, and it was 10 years to do the referendum. But in response on that single event, we decided to phase out the nuclear. And so now for the next 30 years, we are working on finding ways to compensate for this loss of 40% in energy. So that was just one event. It took 10 years and so on to do this, but you see that voters all over the world are responding to those single events that are salient and important for them. And I think this is a bit happening for the US, the fact that in response to the fact that the US walked out from the Paris Agreement, that they slow down all the regulation in the energy sector. I think there's something going on in terms of sentiment toward energy policy outside the US. But I cannot say much about how it will play out, but there is a big thing.
Well, let's expand on that one, bring it back to the U.S. And since the announcement that the U.S. would pull out of Paris, of course it didn't pull out, because you can't until the end of this administration. But that provides a signal for the future of behavior. Are we seeing behavioral responses in corporations or any place else in the United States based upon this signal that just came from our president? Your president. Somebody's president. Is it mattering in corporations? Are corporations doing anything different because of that? Or is it actually a non-event as far as you can tell?
I think there's the kinds of investments that corporations make are long-lived, and they're going to outlast the Trump administration, and so they've got to kind of think, is there going to be a backlash to what's going on here? And the move to establish, say, internal pricing of carbon, I don't think it's going away with these firms, because there would be a high risk associated with ignoring that. I mean, there are some utilities that really want to save their coal plants, and they have some rationales for that, and there is some sympathy for that, although it, to the extent that that's a costly endeavor, that's going to be hard to support, I think.
Yeah, I think that there are a few things to think about here. One is that many firms are multinational.
Yeah.
And if you're a multinational firm, you're really taking into account not what's going on in just the US right now, but you're taking into account what's going on around the world. And if the US tries to pull out, you still have a lot of countries, all but one, I guess, who are still planning on signing the Paris Agreement. It remains to be seen, of course, but there's still a lot of impact. There's still quite a lot of impact on those corporations. So my understanding, when I speak with people in corporations, especially multinationals, but even US companies that have taking a long run view, utilities, for example, they take a long run view and they're making decisions. If you're going to build a new power plant, that power plant, you don't want to be around for 5 years. You want that to be around for 25 years at least. That's a big decision. So shadow pricing is extremely common. And in fact, I don't know many utilities who don't use shadow pricing for new facilities. Now, yes, I do agree that they may be trying to hold on to old facilities longer. And that's absolutely playing a role on old coal plants. But when you look at the corporate sector, by and large, and there are certainly exceptions, they seem to still be moving forward on trying to incorporate some sort of pricing. Usually it's, as I said, shadow pricing, which basically means incorporating the carbon pricing in new investment decisions, not explicitly carbon pricing, to prepare for a world where there is a carbon price and to make sure that investments are not going to be left stranded. There's a huge amount of work that companies are undertaking, firms in the oil industry are undertaking about stranded assets. Are we going to have to worry about stranded assets or not? And if we don't, what are the arguments we can give in performing those types of analyses? And given how much, what's going on around the world, we do see, quite a lot of momentum that's continuing in that direction.
Okay, before we get into more questions, I promise I'm going to go to questions from the audience. And I'm going to start that just as soon as we either flesh out this question or I ask one other. So if you're ready to ask questions or comments or yell at us, whatever, get in line back to the microphone and we'll go from that.
I just wanted to add to what Ken was saying, that in parts of the world or parts of the country where there are price policies that put a price on carbon, there are efforts to kind of shore up that price. And one of those efforts that's bearing fruit is in the EU ETS. There's something called a market stabilization reserve, which is this idea that if a number of allowances sort of out there in the bank gets big enough, that they're going to start retiring them, because basically that means there's a lot of potential to cover emissions that we aren't really using, and so maybe it's cheaper to control carbon than we thought, so let's make the whole program commensurately more aggressive. And in light of perhaps that and other commitments to retire coal plants in the future, the price of CO2 in Europe has spiked up quite a bit recently, suggesting some expectations that that's going to be more binding.
Yeah, just a quick remark. One thing that I was very surprised with when there was a change of the administration is how the automotive industry was handled, especially Ford. Because I remember, and I kept that article, but on day 2 of the Trump administration, you had the CEO of Ford meeting with Trump, complaining about the CAFE standard. And if anything, I thought that Ford was in very good shape with respect to CAFE standard. They just redesigned the Ford 150. They were all in with the aluminum frame, and so I think they were one of the companies that internalized the price of carbon, and they were ready to move on. And then on day 2, they said, actually, it's not good. So maybe I'm not that optimistic. Maybe there are some industries that are better to internalize the price of carbon. Some are, and for me, the automotive industry has been a bit of a puzzle.
Let's go to questions. Jim.
If I may, I really enjoyed this session, and I commend you, Jim, for organizing it in this fashion. Hope we do it more at our conferences. But I have a question that's based on the fact that the world has really a long history of demonstrating that individuals, humans, consumers, cling to what I call single-factor theories of value. Marx had the labor theory of value, where all decisions and pricing should be based upon embodied labor. Since the 1930s, we've had the energy theory of value. The technocrats thought all prices should be in proportion to the entropy. Maybe we have a carbon or emission theory of value going on now. To me, these all are potential biases, behavioral biases, where people are making decisions willing to trade off an arbitrary amount of one factor to get a very small reduction in another factor. Karen, you mentioned your daughter takes the scooter despite the risk. I mean, that's the kind of example that I'm talking about. Am I the only one? I haven't seen this in the literature, that this could be a potentially important behavioral bias that affects energy decisions and investment decisions pertaining to climate change. Is it just me, or is there something to this hypothesis?
Well, there definitely is with respect to climate policy. I mean, I think, okay, if we can't get a price on carbon, what we can do is promote the energy efficiency, but to a large extent renewables. But there are other technologies out there that could be part of a decarbonizing, say, the electricity sector that gets kind of short shrift in the policy world. And I think the focus on the goal should be on, and I mean, there are reasons, they're learning by doing types of reasons and maybe other benefits associated with the policies that have supported renewables. But if the goal really is decarbonization, you know, or an efficient energy supply system incorporating the external cost of carbon, that, you know, we should be open more broadly to options there.
I agree with that.
And my only comment is, what single focus on carbon dioxide? I live in California, where we've just passed a law that said by 2045 we shall have totally zero carbon electricity system. As a matter not just as a goal that has been coded into the law. So I see, and I watch what the Air Resources Board in California has done in their low carbon fuel standard, which is one of those things where the price of the carbon credits get up to $150 per ton of carbon equivalent. So yes, in California, that's there in spades. Yeah.
Can I add one more thing to that, though? I think there is something very true to what you're saying in agreement. California's case is a great case, but it's not just in California. So what I often see now is that advocacy groups that are advocating for a whole variety of different things often piggyback on carbon. So for people who are concerned about local air pollution and environmental justice concerns will piggyback on carbon and say carbon has to be done in a way, any carbon reduction policy has to be done in a way that makes sure that it reduces emissions for communities that are minority communities, whereas you could have come up with potentially a more efficient policy to reduce emissions to those same communities, but they find carbon is so salient. It's something that everyone's talking about, which actually makes it often easy to really focus on that and bring things along in that way.
Yes, I'd like, John Valentine, Brandeis University, I'd like to go back to the energy efficiency paradox. And as I recall, there's a series of papers and projects that Stavens and his people at Helfer sponsored. Some of you may be involved in it. And as you recall, as I remember the papers, they were talking about insulating, existing housing where there would be no cost to the people living in this low-income housing. And I think they, in general, had about 20% conversion or something in that level. And then you and so the question I have is, did we just misspecify the transaction cost in that these people would have to move out of their houses and that was a high transaction cost? And then you contrast that with what happened in the Netherlands, after OPEC 1 and 2 was essentially, there was a huge move to insulating their houses and becoming much more energy efficient. And so I wonder from a behavioral standpoint, if we should be looking at different cohorts differently, or is there a broad sort of just transaction cost that we just didn't really quite understand?
You think that's Sebastien?
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, it speaks to, I started with iteration with respect to income is really important. I think different income group at different type of legal issues and asset costs would be one of those. And I think that study kind of demonstrate. But now we have a couple of studies doing kind of a similar experiment with the medium and high income households. We're they contrast the take-up rate. I think when I say income is first order, and I think for the second order is values, and different population have a different set of values, and I think this is hard to quantify, and what are values, but I think this is what the big driver of why in the Netherlands everybody did it and not so much in the US. So I don't know well the Netherlands, but there's probably something different. And just knowing by the fact that everybody agreed that we should bike to work or to go from A to B,
Right.
means that they are probably more environmentally conscious or something like that. So maybe this is underlying values that the problems there.
And maybe that's some of the peer effects that you're talking about before. If everybody else is biking to work, you bike to work. And if nobody else is, well, you're less likely.
I can comment briefly. I agree with everything Sebastien said. In a sense, though, your question is there an energy efficiency paradox or not? And I don't think I can answer that question fully. I think there are, for sure, cases. One way to put it is it's very much a case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm.
That there are cases where where you can point to other hassle costs, transaction costs, search costs that potentially could be very important. When I mentioned rational inattention before, there are additional costs implicit in that. But we also do know from behavioral economics, and I really should emphasize this, that there are very clear biases that consumers have in their decision making. Where the challenge comes in is in parsing apart and differentiating between those two. And I think that there are cases that it's hard to explain some things without behavioral biases in certain cases. But then there are others where it might be easier to explain them based on other costs. And so I know that's not a complete answer. I believe there still is somewhat of a paradox, and I believe this is an area that we need even more work in to try and parse this apart.
But we all know, look, that our own behavior, sometimes the things we look back and said, if I were rational, I would have started losing weight 10 years ago. I keep thinking about that myself. And I think the idea that we all perfectly optimize in terms of our objectives at least doesn't 100% work for me. And I actually think about, I'm into energy efficiency, yet things have been happening in my house, has been pointed out, hey, all you had to do was make these changes, and of course, and I haven't had it until I started thinking about it. So it does happen. My issue is how much we quantify and where it is. And there's been a great variation in the literature from some studies that say, hey, it doesn't exist at all, to others where you see some examples. Mike Keynes gave a nice paper in one of the sessions here about public housing, where it showed that hey, there was a big payoff for some expenditures putting in there, where there was a budgetary constraint that just got in the way of the optimization.
Just a brief comment, just to Sebastian's point on values, because I had one of my students who's from University of Massachusetts, 6,000 students, 60 parking spaces. Everybody bikes there. So would Stanford put in 100 parking spaces in Palo Alto? It's relatively flat there. You could bike there. And so, I mean, that gets, I don't think that's bias. I think that's a value statement about the general students. And I'm still kind of floored by that rain or shine, they bike and wear the right clothing.
Next. And
Jim,
everybody should keep giving their names as they ask a question.
Okay, Jean-Michel Glachan from School of Regulation. Jim, you did read the question from my mind. My question. Do energy consumers perform better or worse with energy efficiency that food consumers perform with their own health efficiency?
Or healthcare.
And I think that as we look across consumer behavior, we see less than optimizing in preventive health care. We see less than optimizing in eating patterns for people. I think we see less than optimizing in the energy efficiency. And I think sometimes we maybe are less than optimizing in how we might want to spend their leisure time. I mean, how many people got up from Adjunct television program and said, you know, I could have read a book and done a lot better. So I think that the model of an optimizing consumer was a good first order approximation. I think we've got to understand where it works pretty well and where it doesn't work. But if we want to assume it's 100%, I think across the board, you see so many notions of non-optimizing that have been studied by social psychologists who can lay out some of the factors leading to it. So I don't know your explicit answer to your question, which you do worse on, because I think you do have problems in at least all of those.
Anybody else agreeing, disagreeing with Jim?
I always agree with you.
Yeah.
But just to point out a bit on data, there's a bit of work being done nowadays on the concept of energy literacy. The energy literate is one factor among many others that will determine whether or not to make a good decision. But that work is showing that there is a strong correlation with the financial literacy and energy literacy. Now people are pushing in food literacy and health literacy. So there's kind of a research program out there trying to make sense of correlated biases, I would say, across important decision environment. And I can just speak of financial literacy and energy literacy. There is a strong correlation. People that are not too sophisticated with respect to financial decision tend to be also less sophisticated with respect to energy decision and all type of energy decision. Habit forming energy decision, how much I consume, and also whether or not I invest in that.
Thank you.
Yeah, Marie Paul from Precourt University, this is Stanford University. I very much applaud your thought about the human being the error in the system and having also respect for human decisions. And I also very much believe in education. And so my question is the following. I read a lot about technology, and we have been hearing a lot about technology, but there are two problems with technology. First, technology uses energy, and second, I believe that technology also makes us dumb and forget some basic physical principles in how we operate our appliances, for instance. And I wonder if you, what your thoughts are on educating people on energy usage, if you maybe have some studies to cite where specific trainings have been tried instead of doing optimization with some technology and houses, and which differences they might have found.
From drugs from my research group at ETH and a bit from my work. So Massimo Flivini that I'm working with at ETH, a big part of his research program is like, okay, to measure energy literacy and financial literacy. And what he has shown is like, if you educate people with simple tools with respect to energy literacy, you might be able to change decisions and push people toward a better decision. So Massimo is pretty excited about, okay, let's teach people about concepts of energy literacy and give decision tools to help them to be more sophisticated, less dumb, let's say. In my work with low-income people, we have done energy education class, 3 hours class, online class, trying to teach about low-cost behavior change and so on. And we have seen that that works, changing behavior, not for a long time, but it has an impact. But if you ask me, with respect to those findings, how I feel about automation versus education, I don't see that much I don't see automation as being that much of a big problem. Because if you take the example of those energy education class, it's 3 hours, they have to go 2 Saturdays somewhere. Yes, they know much more about energy, but if you look at the impact of information alone, that didn't work that well. It's not persistent. And we discovered that actually without energy education, if you force them with a bit of price mechanism, they find ways to find a slack in the system. So maybe a combination of incentive and automation, for me, might be a good substitute to put the burden on the people to get better educated. Because I think at the end it's a small thing with energy costs and the whole range of decisions that we're making if you compare health, financial. So maybe this is where you want to go with it actually.
Let me add in a different type of education, and it's an experiment we did with Girl Scout troops in the United States. We did this with Stanford. Gave them, and we did a dual comparison. One we did water, the other we did energy, and gave the girls some education about energy. But they made commitments of things they would do that would be energy efficient in their home. They put some clothes on the line to dry. They turn off the televisions after they leave the room. A group of little things, or they would take their parents. They would go with their parents to a hardware store and buy LEDs and replace the other light bulbs. So some they could do alone, some they would do with their parents. And then they would go back to the Girl Scout troop and explain what they did to everybody, and they all rewarded each other for what they're doing. They got little merit badges, an energy merit badge. And we did measure afterwards what the effect was. It changed the parents' behavior on energy efficiency. We don't know if over the long term it'll change the girls, but it sure did change the parents paying attention to their energy use and what they can do. So there's a lot of ways you educate, and it's not just book learning always. Sometimes we learn from our children if you do it right.
Thanks.
Okay.
I'm Jim Smith from Southern Methodist University. Do I get a second shot?
Well, after the person right back of you.
Okay, it's my honor. My name is Jing Yang. I'm from University of Maryland, and I really like the discussion. And I have some questions following the rebound effect. So the rebound effect, does that mean the low-income families are more likely to have this rebound effect? And similarly, will the energy efficiency programs in developing countries such as China will have a larger rebound effect? And also, the renewable energy is kind of similar in a lot of ways to the energy efficiency reduces the carbon emissions. And also, my question is, will there be the rebound effect for the renewables?
Let's give a quick shot, and we want to make sure there's room for Jim. Before we run out of time, I'm going to stop my watch right now to allow us to not run out of time. So, some quick answers to the questions from my grad students.
So there were several questions in there. To start, you asked, people long thought that low-income households are more likely to have a larger rebound effect. By rebound effect, I mean the behavioral response to improved energy efficiency, leading you to use more energy. So the price of using energy is a little bit cheaper per usage, so per mile, if we're talking about fuel economy, is a little bit lower, so people will use a bit more. And people have figured long that, I mean, what matters most about different income groups is what's on the margin, so what people would do next if they are choosing to do that. Do they need to? Do they want to drive a bit more? Like, what is the demand? People long thought low-income households would be higher. I did a review at one point, I had a paper under review of environmental impacts and policy, and the empirical review didn't actually show that it was much higher at all for developing countries. It could be higher in any given setting. So it could be higher if you're talking about a group of households that are lower income and a group of households that are high income. But it's not obvious. You know, what our review showed is that there wasn't like one clear trend that was always that way. I tend to think about when we're talking about renewables, that's a little different of a rebound effect. I think there you're not changing the energy efficiencies or the cost per mile is changing. There you're kind of changing how much you're spending in your energy bill in general. And so there could be a rebound-like effect. It's a little bit different. And there's a little bit of evidence about that coming out. And I think your advisor's working on a paper, or maybe you are working on a paper on that as well. Yeah.
Anybody want to add the last one before we give Jim the ultimate question?
And it's more of an abstract question. I don't know if you're willing to take one this late in the afternoon, but it's about methodology. And Karen mentioned at the beginning the importance of ongoing research to inform policymaking and the effects of consumer behavior, or the drivers of consumer behavior. And this is not my field, it's not my literature, but I'm aware that there's a pretty fundamental distinction between stated preference research and revealed preference research into a lot of these questions. And I don't know the answer, but as someone that tries to appraise the literature, I just wonder, what can you tell us about the relative contributions of stated preference versus revealed preference? What do we need to know if we want to embrace the literature and take away the right?
Okay, you guys can answer and quickly and note the time.
Well, I think just something quick on just focusing on if we want to understand behavioral issues or try to identify behavioral issues, there's a lot of work being done with trivial preference data or approaches. The problem with those methods or those approaches, basically you have the paper with the 1-1-1 rule. You have one market, one policy, one bias, and you have to work pretty hard with trivial preference data to identify that behavioral anomaly or issue. If you think about, let's say, a present bias, and you want to say, okay, our car buyers are present biased, it's almost impossible to answer that question with trivial preference data. Because you will need to observe a preference reversal, so people, what they would have purchased. This is very hard to have the right context to illustrate behavioral bias with trivial preference data. So you see much more work with stated preference focusing on biases and so on. So a lot of the evidence are using conjoint choice analysis or machine choice experiment. But I think, in terms of, if you want to write a really good papers and you are a grad student out there and say, okay, what is a recipe for a very nice publication? The 1-1-1 rule is a good recipe. I'm a bit cynical about this because sometimes you have to interact with biases and this is very hard to just, maybe it doesn't mean much to just focus on biases. But I think there's a real challenge and this is a nice empirical challenge to use real preference data and try to find out about biases.
Let me just quickly add, there is a third method, and that's direct observation of brain functioning. And where there's, again, something we've done at Stanford. Nick Save is the guy who did the thing where he's looking at the energy, at people making choices and being shown Energy Star or not show Energy Star. And you'll see that one group of people who are either heavy environmental or impulsive decision making, you'll see a lot of brain activity in the part of the brain that is associated with the pleasure principle. I forget the name of the brain. If you get somebody do the same thing with somebody that's much more mathematical, you'll see the part of the brain having to do with mathematical reasoning as they make decisions on trade-offs between an energy efficient and non-energy efficient appliance in the presence of that information. So you're just beginning to have in some of these things, beginning to, just tiny bits of things, being able to have a third methodology which is beginning to observe brain functioning and at least what parts of the brain are stimulated by the sort of choices. So you at least have 3 different methodological approaches. But on that answer, I'm going to call this to a close and thank Sebastien, Karen, Ken for putting up with all of my questions.